Be here today and for organising the commemoration for Tommy Donovan. Ladies and gentlemen, on this day, 101 years ago, 31st of October 1920, Commandant Tommy Donovan, a native of Glengool who resided with his aunt in Drangan and was the founding commandant of the 7th or Drangan Battalion of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade Irish Republican Army, was murdered in Kilnall, County Tipperary, by British forces. Thomas O'Donovan was born in Glengool, Tipperary, in 1896. He joined the Irish Volunteers in May 1916. I'm sure Donovan's decision to join the Irish Volunteers was heavily influenced by the execution of the leaders of the 1916 Rising in Dublin in that very month, May 1916. Later that month, he was arrested and transported to Frangach, the 1916 Rising internment camp in Wales. Upon release, he immediately re-involved himself in the work of organising and drilling volunteers. O'Donovan proved himself to be a very capable soldier with a keen intellect, qualities soon recognised within the movement, so that by the year 1918, he was elected first commandant of the 7th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the Irish Republican Army. O'Donovan was very soon a high priority among the wanted men on the British hit list. Throughout 1919 and 1920, he took part in numerous militant Republican activities, including the capture and burning of Drangan Barracks, where along with Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, Sean Hogan and Seamus Robinson, he accepted the British surrender. He also organised and participated in the ambush at Newtown Cross on the 2nd of July 1920, where an RICU sergeant was killed. The last few months of his life were spent constantly on the run with his flying column. On the evening of his death, O'Donovan held a meeting with his men. That evening's mission was to travel to Kilnall and fire a few rounds at a British sentry parading outside the military barracks to draw out others, specifically Lieutenant Litchfield, or he was known as Litchfield at the time, but by the volunteers, but in recent years we've discovered his real name was Litchford, Litchford. The following account of the events leading to the death of Commandant Tommy O'Donovan is taken from the Bureau of Military History statement of Captain Paddy Ryan, Kerry Street, Feathert, who was one of the members of the IRA raiding party in Kilnall on this night 101 years ago. I quote from Paddy Ryan. At this time, probably about the autumn of 1920, I was on the run and spent practically all my time with Donovan and some others who were also on the run in the 7th Battalion area. I remember Donovan telling us that he had orders from GHQ to shoot a Lieutenant Litchfield of the British Army, who was then stationed in Kilnall. And Donovan in turn gave us orders that if the opportunity ever came our way, we were to shoot Litchfield at sight. On a few occasions we went into Kilnall at night and patrolled the streets there, but failed to see Lieutenant Litchfield. Then, on Sunday 31st of October 1920, I was present at a meeting which was held at Kennedy's of Silverford, about 6 miles from Kilnall, at which Donovan decided to take a party of us into Kilnall that night. His plan was to fire a few shots at the sentry who patrolled outside the barracks, and in this way to lure Lieutenant Litchfield out of the barracks. Amongst those who cycled from Silverford to Kilnall that night were Tommy Donovan, then, as I have said, Commandant of the 7th Battalion, Sean Hayes, Nicholas Maroney, Dennis Sadler, Harry Bush, Patrick Clancy, Tommy Lee and myself. There were some others whose names I cannot now recall. We were all armed with revolvers. We halted at the creamery just outside Kilnall, just down this way. Here some Kilnall volunteers met us and reported that the sentry was on duty outside the barracks. Donovan then sent Patrick Clancy and I into the town to scout around and see if everything was quiet. While we were on this duty, we saw 2 RIC men leave the barracks and go down the street and into O'Connell's public house. The sentry was at that time still on duty outside the barracks. Donovan, who had followed us into the town, also saw the 2 RIC men enter O'Connell's, and he remarked to Clancy and I, "This makes it easier. We will capture the 2 policemen and hold them as hostages." He then sent Tommy Lee and another volunteer to the rear of the premises with orders not to permit anyone to leave by the back door. Donovan, Clancy and I then went to the front door and knocked. There was some delay about opening the door. In fact, we had to knock long and persistently before it was opened to us. There was no sign of the two policemen in the shop, and the lady who was there said that they had left. We searched the office and the tap room, but no sign of them. The lady in charge of the shop shouted and screamed that they had left, that they were not there. Donovan opened the back door and Tommy Lee, who was outside, assured him that no one had left by the back door. We tried to calm the lady by telling her that we did not intend to shoot or harm the RIC men, but to no avail. She became so violently hysterical that we abandoned our idea of searching the upstairs portion of the house for them. Returning to the street, Donovan said, "We will carry out our original plan and fire at the sentry." But when we went towards the barracks, we saw that the sentry had been withdrawn and the barrack door was then closed. We moved down the street and when about 100 yards from the barracks, stood for a few minutes while Donovan considered what our next move should be. What looked to us to be two very drunken British soldiers then came around the corner about 50 yards away from us. They had their arms around each other's shoulders and were singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow." They staggered about the street, and as they approached us, Donovan remarked to me, "Will we hold them up?" And I replied, "What's the use? They're only two drunken soldiers." Donovan's remark were the last words he ever spoke, for when the two soldiers were about 2 yards from us, they shed all signs of intoxication and fired point blank at us with revolvers, which they had in their hands. They were in fact Lieutenant Litchfield himself and a sergeant of his unit. Donovan was hit in the head by a shot, and as he fell, he too fired, and I saw the bullet from his gun break the surface of the road. I was hit by a bullet which entered my right leg just over the knee and emerged near the groin. Clancy was wounded in the arm and back. Both Clancy and I crawled to the opposite side of the street where we were again fired at, but this time without effect. I next saw Litchfield and his companion catch Donovan by the legs and drag him to the barracks. Harry Push and Nicholas Moroney came to the assistance of Clancy and myself. They put me on a bicycle and, holding me on it, one at each side, they took me to a house some distance from the town. Clancy was able to walk. The wounds in his arm and back were not so serious as what was first feared. We were then taken in a pony and trap to Hayden's of Parsons Hill, near Drangan, where Dr. Stokes of Feathert attended to us both. It was dangerous to remain at Hayden's at this house, as this house was frequently raided, so again in the pony and trap we were brought to Tobin's of Knockkelly, where we remained for the night, and next day we were removed to Dordan's of Slievenamon. After 2 or 3 days at Dordan's, it was learned that British military with bloodhounds were searching the countryside for wounded men, and we were moved further afield to Cal's of Grangemokla, where we remained for some 9 or 10 days. From Cal's we were taken again by pony and trap to Donovan's of Castlejohn near Calvin. This latter house was situated in a nice quiet place, and a neighbouring nurse called each day to dress the wounds. Dr. Stokes of Feathert and Dr. Conlon of Mullinahone paid weekly visits to me while I was a patient at Donovan's. It was some months before I was able to move about again, and then the weakness of my leg prevented me from taking an active part with either the active service unit or with the flying column. So I returned to my own company area of Feathert. I was of course still on the run and could not return to my home. Thomas O'Carroll of Drangan Village, in his Bureau of Military History witness statement, gives us more details of the activities of the 7th Battalion 3rd Tipperary Brigade on the night of the 31st of October 1920. Here is the excerpt from his statement which details those activities and gives the background to the raid on Kilnall. About this time, that is October 1920, the officer in charge of British forces stationed in Kilnall was a Lieutenant Houghton. He let it be known that if either himself or any of his men were ever attacked, he would bring out a party of British forces and burn down the village of Drangan. We had information that, in company with the sergeant, he was in the habit of frequenting Connell's public house in Kilnall at night time. A member of the Madlass Company, the late Michael Burke of Knockforla, had been arrested by Houghton and was then undergoing a prolonged hunger strike in Cork. We were daily expecting to hear of Michael Burke's death. At a battalion council meeting which was held in the barn of Mrs. Kennedy's farmhouse at Silvercourt near Maglass on Sunday the 31st of October 1920, it was decided to challenge Houghton's threat, and the following plans were drawn up. Dennis Sadler, the battalion vice commandant, to take a party of 5 or 6 members of the ASU into Killinall that night to raid O'Connell's premises and to shoot Houghton. Scouts from the Killinall company to keep in contact with Sadler and his party and to let them know when Houghton and his friend the sergeant had left the barracks and gone to Connell's public house. I was to go to Drangan to mobilise the local unit and make preparations to deal with the British forces if and when they came to the village to carry out their threat. In this I was to be assisted by Sean Hayes and his company. Tommy Donovan, the battalion commandant, was to go to Hayden's at Parsons Hill between Drangan and Killinall, where Hayes and myself were to report back to him that night, and where Sadler and his party were also to report on their return from Killinall. All would then go to Drangan for what we termed the defence of Drangan. Sean Hayes joined me that evening in Drangan, and having made our plans for the night, we went to Hayden's at Parsons Hill to report to Donovan about 8 or 9 p.m. Donovan was not there. Thinking that he might be at King's of St. Johnstown, we went on there. The house was in darkness, but in answer to our knocking, Mrs. King opened the door. She answered me in rather frightened tones. She asked me in rather frightened tones what had happened, and as I paused, rather surprised, she added, "Tommy Donovan is dead. He was shot tonight in Killinall." This was a bit of a shock to Hayes and myself. Subsequently, I learned that before leaving for Killinall, Sadler had some difference of opinion with Donovan about the plans for when they got to Killinall. Donovan decided to go with them. In Killinall, they failed to contact the scouts if the scouts were ever put out, and after waiting for some time, Sadler was of the opinion that the job should be called off for that night. Taking 2 members of the party with him, Paddy Ryan of Feathert and Pat Clancy of Ballylusky, Donovan went up the street and knocked at the door of Connell's public house. After some hesitation, Mrs. Connell admitted them. Lieutenant Houghton and the sergeant were not there. Donovan and his 2 men then left the public house and took up a position on the opposite side of the street, and shortly afterwards Houghton and the sergeant left the barracks and came down the street in the direction of Connell's. Donovan then crossed the street in the bright moonlight in front of them. The sergeant shot him while he, Donovan, was still in the act of getting his Colt automatic out of his pocket. I also learned at the time that Donovan was not dead when he was brought into the barracks, and that in the barracks Lieutenant Houghton fired a shot at him which proved fatal. The threat to come out to burn Drangan did not materialise on that night or on any other night. And so, on this night, 101 years ago, the first commandant of the 7th Battalion of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, Commandant Tommy O'Donovan, was murdered in direct contravention of the Hague Convention, which directed that prisoners of war be treated humanely and not mistreated. Wounded and arrested, Tommy Donovan was not a threat to anyone. There was a duty on the occupants of the barracks to give him the medical care that he required and not to mistreat him. That medical assistance was not given him, and instead he was shot dead inside the barracks. Sadly, Commandant Tommy O'Donovan was the first, but not the last, of the 7th Battalion to give his life in the cause of Irish freedom. He was followed 19 days later, on the 19th of November 1920, by his comrade Lieutenant Pat Clancy of Ballylusky, Drangan, who, as you heard from the witness statement of Paddy Ryan, was wounded here in Killinall also that night, 101 years ago, and having been wounded, spent the next 18 days or so recuperating in a number of safe houses around the Grangemokler area. On the 19th of November, Pat Clancy decided to pay a visit home to see his family at Ballylusky, but was intercepted outside Drangan by the infamous Litchfield from Killinall Barracks and shot dead in cold blood. Volunteer Michael Ryan was shot by the Black and Tans on the 19th of February 1921. Their comrade Tommy Lee of Feathert, a member of the 1st Battalion Rose Green, who was present here in Killinall with Tommy Donovan on this night in 1920, was killed by British troops outside Feathert on the 4th of March 1921. 2 days later at Knockrow, Drangan, on the 6th of March 1921, Adjutant Martin Clancy of Ballylusky, Drangan, Captain Dick Fleming, Coolbawn, Medlass, and Volunteer Patrick Hackett of Rathkenny, Drangan, were murdered by Crown forces in an ambush at Knockrow, Drangan. On the 13th of June 1921, Commandant Dennis Sadler of Rathkenny, Drangan, was accidentally shot by a column comrade at Cluneen. The unfortunate civil war was to claim the lives of volunteer Michael Heffernan of Cluneen at Newtown, Drangan on the 8th of September 1922. Michael Sadler of Rathkenny, Drangan on the 3rd of November 1922 at Marl Hill, Cashin. Jim Hayes of Medlass at Silverfort on 20th November 1922. Volunteer Patrick Bennett of Ballingarry was killed in action at Glenbower on the 3rd of December 1922. And that, ladies and gentlemen, only lists those from the 7th Battalion and those present in Kilnall on the 31st of October 1920 who gave their lives in pursuit of Ireland's freedom. Unfortunately, there are so many more too numerous to mention. Today, the 31st of October 2021, we remember you, Commandant Tommy Donovan, as one of the courageous IRA soldiers who took the fight to the British Army occupying Ireland and whose struggle won for us the freedom of 26 of Ireland's 32 counties. We salute you, Commandant Tommy O'Donovan, the first Commandant of the 7th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade, Irish Republican Army. And also the first of the 7th Battalion to die for the cause of Irish freedom. We salute you and all your comrades who lost their young lives in the effort to create a better life for all who came after you. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask for a moment's silence as a remark of respect to their memory. The cause of Commandant Tommy O'Donovan and of his comrades is not yet achieved, but it is closer than ever before, and the topic of uniting our country is spoken of these days with renewed optimism. It was the execution of the 1916 leaders which prompted Tommy O'Donovan to join the Irish Volunteers. The achievement of the 1916 proclamation's ideal of cherishing all the children of the nation equally and ridding our country of homelessness, of poverty, of inequality and of deprivation is the only real and legitimate way to honour the struggle of Commandant Tommy O'Donovan and of his comrades. We have a way to go to achieve those ideals, but the democracy given to us by the struggle of Commandant Tommy O'Donovan and his comrades, combined with the peace process, the peace given to us by the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement, those ideals are more achievable than ever before. The task of creating that better Ireland to honour the ideals of Tommy O'Donovan and his comrades is not just for our politicians and statesmen, though they bear a huge responsibility that very often is not taken seriously enough. The job of creating that better Ireland, the Ireland which Pearse aspired to in the proclamation of independence on Easter Monday 1916, which would cherish all the children of the nation equally, is the responsibility of each one of us in our daily lives. As another great Irish patriot, Bobby Sands, said, "Everyone has their own particular part to play. No part is too great or too small. No one is too old or too young to do something." Let us keep these aspirations in our minds and in our hearts and go on to create a nation that we can all be proud of, where homelessness, poverty, deprivation and inequality are banished, and where the generous spirit of Commandant Tommy O'Donovan and his comrades lives on in the daily lives of each one of us. Araigling, Garamil Mahagul Galer.